Let's kick off, and the other participants are going to join us. And please feel very welcome, all of you. Once again, good morning, Erinch. Thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to meet you. And on behalf of this group, we feel grateful and, of course, privileged for the generosity of your time. Congratulations as well for being turning Doughnut Economics from a radical idea into a sort of transformative action, particularly in the business world. And as I mentioned in our emails, this is a group composed of business and thought leaders of many of Brazil's leading companies. And under this leadership program, we are debating critical issues every month based on a book that is selected to serve as a sort of a framework for the discussions. So this month, we're talking about, of course, Doughnut Economics. And in order to respond to this broader question, which is how can we rethink the economy for the 21st century? And then on top of that, we have these special sessions with leading thinkers and change makers like yourself, who inspire us to not only think better, but also, of course, to act accordingly. And so please feel free to kick off with your presentation. We are very grateful above all and to you. Thank you so much, Erinch.
Great, thank you, Alex. I will share my screen and hopefully it shares the correct screen when I begin. It's showing the correct one, right? All right, yeah. Fantastic. So honored to be with you all. My name is Erinch Sahan and I lead the work at Doughnut Economics Action Lab on translating this concept and idea of Doughnut Economics into business. So what does this mean for business? What kind of transformations do we need to drive? What can business leaders do and those who work with and around business do? So I feel privileged, sometimes overwhelmed by that task of taking this planetary concept to a level of what does it mean day to day for business. And hopefully for the next 25 minutes or so, I'll take you on a journey of where our thinking is going. I work very closely with Kate Rayworth. She's a friend. I worked with her at Oxfam many years as well previously. But we're really trying to stretch the ambition around this for the business world. So that's where that's at. My journey into getting into Doughnut Economics has been a little bit of a convoluted one. I started in the business world. I worked at Procter & Gamble. I was a corporate lawyer before that for a while. I worked, around the business world. I had a small startup at one stage. So I was really started life in the business world 20 plus years ago, and then worked much more deep in the supply chain issues. So particularly in Indonesia, bits of Western Africa, ways to address supply chain challenges, which is often where the biggest impacts are. Then moved to Oxfam, where I led a bunch of campaigns for 7 years, particularly focused on food and beverage sector. And most recently, I was the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization, where I tried to really support the fair trade movement to become even more ambitious in the way that we evolve and the kind of businesses that we can generate through the idea of fair trade. So that's my background. It's been always through it. How do we transform business has been the key question of my approach. But what brought me to Doughnut Economics Action Lab is the fact that we are seeing more and more crises. The 21st century has begun with a financial meltdown. It seems so long ago, 2008, but the lessons of that crisis still haven't been fully grasped. I mean, I think we are still coping with a very stretched and precarious international financial system that has suffered this huge shock. And that meltdown has been followed by a series of increasing climate breakdowns around the world. I grew up in Sydney, Australia. I'm originally from Turkey, but in Sydney, Australia, we saw fires, we saw floods, we saw fires again, we saw floods again. In Turkey, where I'm from, I'm seeing the same thing. Along the coast, we're seeing floods followed by fires, these extreme weather events that are becoming more prevalent, more prominent, more frequent, and that climate breakdown is becoming very hard to ignore, I think, everywhere we are. And of course, the COVID lockdown, which is also a lesson for us in what happens when we begin to, stretch the boundaries of the way humans and society and the planet and the natural systems emerge. And some of the diseases and viruses that are going to become more prevalent as we stretch the boundaries of that relationship. So the meltdowns, the breakdowns, the lockdowns, it's been a century of crisis. And in response to these crises, as you all know, because you've been talking about the book, Doughnut Economics proposes a compass for human prosperity. It says we have a planetary ceiling, and let's really respect that planetary ceiling. But at the same time, we cannot shrink our economy below a social foundation. We need to be using some of the resources of this planet. We need to be operating an effective economy on this planet that is also meeting the social needs of, you know, soon to be 8 billion plus people on this planet. So the basic essentials of food, water, livelihoods, education, all of this is essential as well. And it's that space between that planetary boundary and the social foundation, which is the safe and just space for humanity. And that's really what we are trying to work on. What does the economy look like in that space? As many of you know, the inside goals come from the social parts of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the outside goals come from Earth system scientists, particularly Professor Rockstrom and others in Stockholm Resilience Center, who have worked on quantifying those boundaries of our planet. So it's based on those two ideas, but when you bring it together, there's something powerful. And it's powerful because actually, when we look at the picture of ourselves on this planet, we see a picture that is for the first time seen by us. We see this picture, and this picture tells us that we have gotten something wrong, that we are both in planetary overshoot and we are in social shortfall. So we are overusing our planet's resources while under-delivering on life's essentials for the people on this planet. Think of this as a selfie that we've taken together, all of us on this spinning wet rock of ours. We've taken this selfie, and this is what we look like in terms of our relationship with our living planet. In fact, the picture is a little bit worse than it looks, because when we created this, Earth system scientists didn't know how to quantify chemical pollution for the whole planet. They do now, and now it looks like this. Now there's additional reds, as actually we get better at understanding the impact on the planet's boundaries. We realize things that are worse than we thought. We realize how interconnected everything is, and we realize that actually we're fast moving towards a tipping point where Earth systems start to potentially collapse and fall into crises that feed off each other and create feedback loops that make things worse. So that is the planetary picture, just to sort of bring the gravity of the situation into our hearts, into our stomachs, maybe, as we feel what it feels like to look at this global selfie. At a national level, there's also a whole range of number crunching that we and our colleagues at various academic institutes, particularly University of Leeds, have done. And actually what these national pictures tell us is that no country is in the donut. All these countries that we think of as developed countries, as northern high-income countries, actually they've gotten to where they got to by vastly overusing their fair share of the planet's resources. They are in huge overshoot. This is not a developed country we're looking at, whether it's the Netherlands, USA, or now China with its current planetary footprint. It's the same if we swap over Spain, Australia, and actually it's quite bad if we swap into it Brazil as well. As you can see with Brazil and Australia, especially on the phosphorus and the nitrogen, things are so bad that it doesn't even fit on the screen when we tried to cut it. So the way we use our land, the way we use our natural resources is significantly broken at the moment, and yet we are also under delivering on life's essentials. So that's the big global macro picture. But we're here to talk about what does this all mean for business. So when business stares into the donut, what does it tell it? Well, we've been doing a bit of staring. We've been working with some of our friends and colleagues in different organizations to understand where our business is. And we came up with a few ideas. One introductory idea is that we sort of classified a little bit the kind of businesses that we're beginning to see. We've got companies that do nothing, that are right at the bottom of the pile. They're saying, look, it's not my job to fix the planet. The business of business is business. In fact, if there is a regulation and there is a fine and the fine is small, I will continue doing it because it's worth it and I will keep doing what I've always done. Then there's a next level. There's a layer of businesses that are doing what pays now, that are looking at the returns, they're looking at the opportunities of sustainability and saying, look, actually my reputation can benefit. I might get a few more customers. I might get a cost saving from more efficient use of resources. So that pays now, I will do that. Some are looking at it in terms of their fair share and saying, look, we don't know scientifically exactly how to work out our fair share for most of these issues and dynamics, but we will do our best and we will work out what we think our fair share is. Now, if any of you have gone back to restaurants since COVID finished, and we're now around the world, lots of places able to now go back to restaurants in big groups, you'll realize that when the check comes at the end, when people put in their fair share, rarely is their fair share what they think it is. Usually you don't want to be the person holding the check at the end. And I think it's the same with the business world, that we have gotten into a point where actually people think they're doing their fair share or saying they are, but on most of the things they're calculating, it is falling short. And in total, things are falling short. Then we've got the next level up. So the mission zero people are saying, look, zero slave labor, zero poverty wages, zero deforestation, zero net zero carbon emissions. You know, we're seeing that sort of ambition of let's get to zero harm. But as many people have pointed out, why be 100% less bad when we can do good? And that's where we think it's about bringing things into the donut. Now, the other thing that is broken that I think all of you would probably realize is we often see companies who have multiple voices on this. So maybe the CEO goes to Davos or goes to a regional meeting in Latin America and talks big about what they are doing on Mission Zero, but actually the middle management, their incentives are a little bit lower. Their incentives are to do what pays now. And maybe the company commits on doing your fair share, but actually on human rights and supply chains, which is really important, it becomes difficult, maybe a bit costly, maybe a bit complicated. And as a result, they do nothing on that. So we're seeing this disconnect across and within businesses as well. It's a messy game at the moment of big talk, but not enough action. And that inconsistency is a problem. Now, to remind ourselves, why do we need businesses to do the donut, to become regenerative and to become distributive, which I'm going to introduce in a second? It's because we've got a model, or especially in products and goods, that takes from Mother Nature, makes things, uses those natural resources, and then loses them. And we repeat this process over and over again. We do it around the world. And of course, our children and grandchildren will turn to us one day and say, did you know this was the core of our economy? Did you know that we relied on this form of a take, make, use, lose, degenerative, linear model of production and trade? Did you know that this was going on? And of course, we're all going to be mortified that we're a part of an economy that did this to our planet, because it's clearly not a model that can go longer term. And there are alternatives, because we can move from that take, make, use, lose culture, that degenerative model that runs down Earth's life supporting systems, towards a regenerative one that works with and within the cycles of the living world. So the circular economy idea of regenerating based on the biological loops that we can create, and also restoring on all those technical human-made materials. So we minimize waste, we minimize loss. Now, there are examples from the business world of regenerative practices that work with and within the cycles of that living world. Those examples, for instance, is one example from the electronics industry, Fairphone, a business based in the Netherlands that has created a modular phone. And it's modular by design. It's decided that it wants to take away built-in or designed obsolescence that creates the need for consumers to constantly buy new products every few years. Their products are repairable. They sell modular items that can replace and upgrade even parts of it. Now, it's a marginal part of their industry. Most of their competitors have looked at Fairphone and said, look, I make more money by actually selling new phones every couple of years. No, thank you. I will continue my product design, and I will make my phones difficult to repair, if not impossible. And I will make sure that I am increasing my turnover and increasing my margins longer term. But Fairphone has bucked that trend and said, look, it's possible. They're commercially viable. They're able to put this proposition forward. Another company, a large company based out of the United States, Interface, has looked at nature and said, can we learn something through biomimicry? Can we look at the cycles of nature and say, well, what would nature do if they were where we are? If instead of our factories, if the forest existed there, if wildland existed there, what ecosystem services were they providing? What benefit would they be providing to the living world and to us as society? So they are looking at how it sequesters carbon, how it cleans water, how it releases nutrients back into nature. It's designing factories that can behave in ways that mimic Mother Nature. Another example, actually one that I worked on, I was very proud to work on this example when I was in the fair trade movement, working with the Body Shop, which is a part of Natura, which I'm sure many of you based in Brazil would be very aware of. But we're proud to bring the concept of fair trade into plastic recycling for the first time at this scale. So working with waste pickers in India and making sure that they are treated the same way a fair trade coffee farmer or cocoa farmer would be treated, in terms of payment, in terms of support for organizing into democratic producer groups, in terms of payments up front, in terms of long-term commitment to them, and in terms of prices that enable eventually to get to a living income for the waste pickers in India. Now, bringing that social element together with the plastic recycling element to create those bottles was a world first. And that was something that demonstrated it is possible. Now, so far, all these examples I've told you have also had interesting elements of their enterprise design. So the way that they are structured, they've had to also give investments. So their capital expenditure was not the usual way they would calculate. They needed to look at ways their margins work. They needed to have longer term time horizons on their financial parameters for these initiatives to be given the green light. Something unusual has happened within the business to enable these sorts of behaviors, but all of them are commercially viable. All of them are positive and resilient for their business. Last example, which also fits that narrative, is Houdini, a company based in Sweden that makes sportswear and garments. And it has designed its products so that the technical nutrients and the biological nutrients, so the natural fibers, can be easily separated in their garments. What's really interesting about Houdini is that they've then made all of this open source. So they've said to their competitors, copy us, take our intellectual property. We're not obviously going to become the 100% market share of this business, of this industry. The only way we're going to meet this ecological crisis and this ecological challenge is if we build on each other's knowledge, and they've made it open by design. And that model is, again, unusual. It requires a very different form of enterprise thinking, of business leadership, but also financial parameters around the way that they are formulating these strategies and these investments. But it demonstrates it's possible to run a viable and thriving business with that mindset. So that's the ecological side. Let's look at the social. And I think none of you require, any sort of reminder of how important keeping inequality at manageable and lower levels is, how important it is to have an economy that creates opportunity for as many people as possible and spreads that value as far as possible. And of course, we're not doing very well as a planet. We have seen in the majority of people, in fact, 70% of people on this planet live in countries where inequality is increasing. And we have seen a huge concentration of wealth across the world. So that is part of a problem, especially on a planet that has limited ecological, limited natural resources, that we cannot just keep growing our way out of a problem. So the way we distribute the benefits is going to be critical. And the part of the answer is, how do we create distributive dynamics? How do we go from having that divisive model that is capturing opportunity and value in the hands of a few to a distributive one that is sharing opportunity and value with all who co-create it? Big words, big ideas. Let's think, what does this actually look like in practice? Well, a few examples of exactly what was described. One business I know very well from my work most recently in the fair trade world is stakeholder governance model of El Puente. El Puente is based in Germany. It's a multi-million-dollar business that is distributing products from around the world, fair trade products from around the world. And when COVID hit, what they did was they were putting their commitment for their suppliers at the front of the COVID solution. So what they did was essentially give greater orders, greater commitments, and in fact payments up front for orders that they didn't know when they were going to come. So when they saw that their suppliers were struggling, they said, well, actually, we don't want them to topple over. We know that shops have closed, orders are being cancelled around the world. We know you can't get a ship at the moment for export, and there are all sorts of crises happening, and you have a cash flow crisis as a result. So instead of cutting my orders and instead of taking down my risk, what I'll do is I'll give a higher order right now. And I don't know when you can deliver the order, but do it when you can. But here's the cash upfront. This was remarkable, especially in contrast to others in the food industry, but especially in the fashion industry, which they are also a part of, where the opposite was happening. The mainstream players were cutting and slashing orders, they were renegotiating contracts, and it was passing on that risk down the supply chain. And El Puente did the opposite. The reason they did that, and part of their structural ability to do that, is they have a stakeholder governance model. So their board has got representatives of their suppliers on it. They also have representatives of their employees, of community organizations across Germany as well as the founders of the business. So they've got this multi-stakeholder model that brings voices into their board that other businesses don't necessarily have in the same way. Another example is Richer Sounds in the UK, 62 outlets across the UK, a very successful private family business that ended up transferring ownership into an employee ownership model, so that the founders created their own exit from the business through an employee ownership trust. It's a specific mechanism that is in more common law countries to support different ownership models. But it basically meant that because the workers became owners of the business indirectly through this ownership trust, it meant that everything was being decided on the basis of what is good for the long-term resilience of this business. We're not going to sell this to a bigger investor who might asset strip it. We're not going to take decisions that might increase margins today and tomorrow, but are bad for the workers and community. It was able to bake this into the organizational ownership model, and that was really critical. Another example is Fairbnb. It's a platform cooperative, which basically means it's taking cooperative principles into the platform economy. And it's saying, well, how do we have community-focused tourism? Well, let's have half of the income generated through the platform go back into community projects that community organizations can decide. Let's make sure we're not driving inequality. Let's make sure that actually the people that are listing on this platform are people that are not necessarily millionaires and billionaires, but people who own 1 or 2 properties maximum. And let's promote slow tourism. Let's make sure that we have a model where the value is distributed as broadly as possible. So they've created and baked in a model that is, again, a very stark contrast to the regular model in that industry. And lastly is just an example from a large global player, Lush, which has deliberately said, look, we're going to pay our fair share of tax. We're not going to minimize our tax bill, and we're going to use a methodology that the Fair Tax Mark uses in order to demonstrate, look, we are a part of a society that needs an education system, that needs social safety nets, that needs law and order, that needs healthcare, all of these things. We want to make sure we're paying our fair share into that, because we depend as well on these societal systems working. So all of these sort of examples, all of them are unusual, I think you would all agree, for their sector. So then the question starts to come up about how do we go from this degenerative model all the way through a sustainable model towards that regenerative model. So how do we get to these more, I guess, bold, ambitious, pioneering examples in a more effective way? And on the social side, how do we get from this divisive current model we have, for instance, minimum wages that are below the ability of people to meet their basic needs, towards an inclusive one where at least they meet their very basic of needs, to a distributive one where value is distributed, that the upside of the business also is distributed more broadly, like some of the examples I gave. And a part of that is reminding ourselves of the donut, reminding ourselves that Doughnut Economics is telling us that the transformation needs to be really big to go from that left-hand side of overshoot and shortfall to one that is a safe and just space for humanity. That huge transformation that tells us that we need to pursue significant change. Well, let's pause for a moment and reflect. Outside of everything that you heard from me, maybe coming into this discussion, what you might have thought about is, look, there are already lots of things happening. There's lots of effective initiatives that are promoting the business case for sustainability, that are showing actually long-term the returns are better. Long-term, we should invest in this stuff. Long-term, we should make that transition. Absolutely, I agree wholeheartedly. There's some great work going on making the business case. There's also a lot of great work setting goals, metrics, targets for companies, net zero, other ones that are really important to make sure we understand what are we aiming for. There's loads of work going on to promote enlightened leadership among CEOs, among C-suites, among people in the finance sector to push towards the transition. Very effective. That culture change can be really important. And there's a lot of work as well trying to push for legal changes, regulations that will level the playing field for all businesses. So those that are doing more are not at a disadvantage, but also the financial sector of the global economy, trying to become a little bit more focused on ESG, despite recent debates around the role of ESG and social finance. It has played a role in terms of shaping corporate behavior, as well as other ways of having collective action from communities, worker organizations, from farmer organizations, etc. So all of these are different approaches, strategies, complementary often with each other. But what I'm proposing is that there's something missing. If this is all we are doing, we are missing a trick, because the 21st century challenges are so significant that we need all of these actions from the government, from the commons, from civil society, etc. And we need a huge amount from business. And a lot of those current approaches, what they are doing is they are trapping us a little bit on that right-hand side. So they are trapping us in initiatives that are reducing reputational risk like slave labor, or creating energy efficiency. Essentially, what we're doing is we're cherry picking a very small amount of actions from the business world that are not sufficient. And we need action here on this overlap. But if we can redesign our businesses, if we can redesign the possibilities of how action happens, how capital expenditure works, how margins are set, how strategies are set within a company, we can unlock a whole host of other actions that are possible, like the Fair B&B example, like the Fairphone example. A quick example of a business I got to know a little bit was, and I can't mention the name, unfortunately, because I signed a non-disclosure agreement, is a global footwear company who had an amazing product designer that created a new idea for a regenerative shoe. Now that shoe would be expanded over time. That shoe would be at a lower price point. That shoe would mean that children or parents of lower income people and families in the global south across the world would be able to afford a shoe that would last 7, 8, 9 years for their child and would be ergonomically effective. Now, this shoe that he designed after 20 years, a very senior position, he pitched that he crunched the numbers. It was commercially viable. It was profitable. It was going to work. It was going to be a new market for them, several 100 million consumers potentially around the world who might buy this shoe. But the idea was shot down because it wasn't a high enough margin. It was an opportunity lost, not just for that business, but also for the international society, that a product of that level that was potentially going to come from a global company with the reach and the technology and the production and the distribution to make this a success did not happen because of the rigid margin requirements. Another company I got to know very well realized that actually the way it's going to reduce its carbon footprint is going to be through changing from this sort of one single-use products to ones that are going to be refillable. When they crunch the numbers for the capital expenditure needed to justify the transition, as well as into the awareness raising programs that are going to be needed, that investment didn't meet the thresholds that were set. It was close, but it didn't meet it. So it's continuing to create single-use products as a result. All of these are part of the design of the business. So I'm going to transition to the last sort of 5 minutes or so of my presentation to just introduce you to a concept that is at the heart of what we are doing, which is how do we move from a 20th century model of business, which is asking itself, how much financial value can we extract from this enterprise, to the 21st century of how many benefits can we generate in the way we design this business. The way we're doing this is we're using a framework developed by the thinker, author, researcher Marjorie Kelly, who's now at the Democracy Collaborative, that looks at enterprise design, the design of the organizations that populate our economies. And she looks at purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. Quick minute on each one. So purpose, think of why does the business exist? If it's a fast fashion company, it ultimately exists to sell as much product as possible at lower price as possible. It might have human rights commitments that are trying to also reach certain norms and targets, but it's not its core purpose. And alternatives, the one that I got to know well in Uruguay, like Menostil Uruguay, a business that is owned by the producer organizations that are spread across Uruguay. Now, its core purpose is to benefit those communities. It makes every decision with that in mind. So purpose is one thing. We can look at networks as well. The way the business is engaging with those that it is trading with, those that it interacts with. Of course, the supply chain is going to be really critical here. How do we go from that commodity market style world of supply chains to ones that are longer term partnerships that are truly transparent and committed? But also the communities that you're a part of, that businesses are part of, and leaving some of those regressive alliances that hold back progressive action to then join the more progressive voices. So those are the networks, but then we get into governance, and the governance is really about the decision making. And is that governance in service of financial benefits for shareholders or social and ecological benefits for stakeholders? If you take any venture capital funded business, for instance, startup around the world, you will see a governance model that is often in service of financial benefits for shareholders. It is looking for the fastest growth possible. It is looking for an exit that is as high as possible. And the governance structure often reflects that and the decision making that it brings in. However, you can have alternatives like River Simple, a hydrogen car company that has said, every person on our board is going to represent a different stakeholder group, including the planet, including the community. And that custodianship model of boards and governance is also a possibility. Then we move to ownership. And of course, ownership can really drive so much of this. And it doesn't have to be black and white. It could be lots of ways of moving into new models of ownership, including employee ownership, including multi-stakeholder ownership. But one example I wanted to just put on your radar is steward ownership, which is a way of deciding which kinds of shareholder categories do we have, including investors, and what rights do they have in terms of voting rights? Because not every shareholder group maybe has the same rights. Some of them are long-term shareholders. Some of them are going to be people that are involved in the business, understand the fundamentals of the business, and their voice maybe could matter more. What critically stakeholder steward ownership also does is it decides that we're going to have a golden share, a purpose share that is held by another organization that can veto a decision if it undermines the purpose of the business. So all of these businesses have given a golden share or a purpose share to such an organization. And the critical thing is that organization cannot have a financial interest in the business. So they don't get dividends, but their only role, and usually it's a foundation or it is an NGO or a non-profit organization, but what they have in common is that they exist to hold the company to its core purpose. Now, lastly is finance. And of course, the relationship with finance is critical. Everything from the way that sales, profits, market share is pursued and moving towards how does finance serve purpose? How does it expand benefits and reinvest for impact? How do we flex our margins to have that positive impact and thrive long term? So, and to sort of end here, I will just remind you of the main perspective, which is how do we design our businesses differently? How do we go from making sure that, how do we go towards making sure that we design to align the purpose with the processes within the company, like the processes that decide on product design? How do we move to design to lock in the legacy and protect the mission of the business, especially intergenerationally, especially when sometimes capital markets can play an important role in undermining sustainability efforts? How do we design the organization to enable partnerships and engage in stakeholder engagement more broadly to, for instance, ensure supply chain security, to have that long-term partnerships that work? And lastly, how do we design to channel investment to ensure that we're not just maximizing dividends constantly, but we're also allowing for the profits of the business to invest into those innovations internally? So all of these confront you with then the question of how do we go from the donut, taking inspiration from enterprise design, and ask ourselves which aspects of our design are holding us back, and asking ourselves how can our design move us to a thriving future? Alex, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow. Congratulations. Thank you so much, Erinch. It was a tour de force. It was a lot of food for thought. I think I have to digest it. It's a lot of things. So once again, thank you. I'm going to kick off with a question, and then I'm going to open for other questions from the audience, okay? So I'm going to kick off with a very open question, Erinch, because everything you're saying, of course, it changed the status quo. It's something that requires people to revisit their mental models, you know. And so my question is very simple. From your experience, because you have been doing, you know, workshops, you have been doing, you know, seminars with business people. So to what extent business leaders are really, you know, open and willing to implement something across the lines of the Doughnut Economics in their organization? So how willing are they to revisit their mental models and you know, have the courage to take the initiative to change the status quo and to prioritize generosity? Because I think the background of everything we're talking here is to be more generous to the board and to everyone around us, and to give more than we take. And so from your experience, please, if you could share with us, we'd appreciate very much. Are you optimistic?
Well, we've been doing a lot of, as you know, we've been doing a lot of workshops around the world with companies to create a toolkit based on what I just described. And what we've discovered is that every business, and there's been over 100 now we've worked with on these ideas, every business I've met has an idea that gets held back because of the design of the organization. Now, it takes a while for them to discover that, because often we try to be so pragmatic that we only consider the ideas that seem possible. We don't allow ourselves to dream of the things that stretch the bounds of possibility very often, because then it's challenging, then it's difficult, then it confronts us with change. So once we get to that threshold of actually allowing ourselves to dream into what the business could be, you know, and make those big, sometimes scary, ambitious ideas and write them down, then we start to realize, actually, we could design our business to enable more of these ideas. A lot of companies, certainly startups, certainly private companies, it's easier for them to engage in these ideas. And it doesn't mean that everything I mean, I gave some pretty advanced examples of platform cooperatives and multi-stakeholder ownership, and that doesn't have to be the case. It could be having a local NGO as an observer on the board for a while. Or it might be having a deep partnership with maybe 10 of the biggest suppliers. That means that with those 10 big suppliers, you have a long-term commitment, you have a long-term contract, you've got a different pricing structure, you've got a different way of baking into each other's business model, these sorts of shared goals. So a lot of those smaller steps, when you put them on the table, I think people then become a little bit more open. If I just talk about ownership structure transition, I think I will lose some people. But when we realize, look, we recognize that would make things sometimes easier, sometimes harder to change ownership. But there are other intermediate steps. Then we start to see more ambition, more openness from business leaders.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So there is no one size fits all approach. And the idea is to interact, is to engage with each business to understand the realities of that business. So some small, advancements can be made, and over time, hopefully, more of it can become true. So it's very interesting. So far, people are still shy here from our group, so I'm going for a second question. And please raise your hands, those who want to make a question to Erinch. I'm going for a second one, which is basically and touches on the issue of ownership that you mentioned. And Erinch, to what extent do you think it is realistic to expect, that publicly held companies under the pressure of powerful short-term oriented investors will truly, be able to become regenerative and distributive? Do you think we need to work more on these issues of ownership? I know you have been advocating for alternative forms of ownership, such as cooperatives, as an organizational form that can be more likely to become regenerative and distributive by design. So if you could please
yeah, and we're definitely not promoting any particular model. We're taking inspiration from the different emerging innovative models, like including co-ops, but actually that's a very particular model that doesn't always solve every problem in every sector. So I think, but you're right that the financial markets and shareholder-owned companies are in a much more difficult position. They are not the majority of the business world, by the way. The majority of the business world is not listed on share markets, but many of the largest companies and the more prominent companies are around the world. And what we found with them is that it is possible. Unilever, for instance, had a model of buying back shares and producing an increase in employee ownership. And Unilever is one of the largest companies in the food and beverage sector in the world, multi-billion-dollar company. And it's decided that actually its ownership model and the amount of diversity of ownership and unengaged ownership that existed was a barrier to have the sustainability commitment it needed. And Paul Polman decided he's going to have a strategy of increasing the ownership of their own employees. I mean, it's not going to become a cooperative, it's not going to become majority employee owned or anything like that. But what he realized is that this allows for much more of the bolder ideas. He's obviously since left Unilever, but there are many other ways. And I think and it doesn't have to be an ownership shift. It could be, as I said, a different stakeholder group on the board. Germany requires that workers are represented on all boards of larger companies, for instance. There are lots of different smaller things that can be done that help move in that direction of travel. But you're right that for shareholder-owned, publicly listed companies, the challenge can be harder.
Fantastic. So Lucas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Erinch, for your talk. My question is about the broader political implications. We were talking about that before your talk. So my question is how do we move our democracies toward this donut perspective? My concern is that reading the book, it seems that we have this agenda that can be very easily framed as this left-wing thing, and once it's framed as a left-wing, basically left-wing agenda, like almost communist stuff, it can be easily just discarded or denied by a big share of the population. So how do we get more people on board to really understand that this is a broader agenda? It's not simply like an ideological thing, how to remove this ideological tag, or to make it work from the point of view of us as individuals or business. It's very clear that we can do things, but we need also this broader political engagement. So how can we move in this direction?
You're right, Lucas. We're very careful that we don't promote any of the ideas or ideologies of the 20th century. Those are some of the dinosaurs that we need to leave behind. The isms that, Kate talks about this. I mean, in fact, for a long time, I don't think she mentions communism or capitalism in the book. These are the 20th century debates and arguments. And it's much more important to be practical of saying, look, this is the challenge. Which part of the donut do you disagree with? Do you disagree we don't have a planetary boundary? It's hard to disagree, right? Do you disagree that we need life's essentials for everybody on this planet? It's hard to disagree. I mean, I feel like these are not ideological points, and saying that, of course, we don't want to go beyond the planetary boundary. And of course, we don't want to go below the living, life's essentials for people on the planet. So I think that keeping that goal is really helpful to bring everybody along. The second one is to stay practical. And on the business side, I mean, I shared a little bit more of the thinking with you guys, knowing the level of engagement that you have. But when I work with businesses in a deep way, or we've worked with them, we try to get them to think practically of going, what is those biggest ideas that maybe you actually want to discontinue that product line, because that product line is really causing a problem for society and our planet. Or maybe you want to redesign this so it's modular, or you're not selling it, but you're renting it to your consumers, or you're changing the package, like coming up with like a practical reason for why we need to change things for business or for politics, and then thinking, okay, how do we design to make this possible? That feels a bit liberating and a bit distant, hopefully, from ideology, and becomes a little bit more opening minds for people that maybe dismiss you otherwise. I mean, that's the best answer I have, but I think you're right that this is the challenge, that if we fall into the divides of the 20th century, we slow progress.
Perfect. Angela, please.
Thank you, Erinch. Well, recently we saw that humans launched the rockets that can fly sidewalks and go away, come back, and etc. Do you think this kind of technology can diminish or not the strength of the donut economy of Howard's theory, that we have indeed limited resources and we cannot just pull out nuclear waste and mining asteroids and etc. What do you think about that?
It's a really good point, Angela. And the other thing that came to my mind when I saw those rockets is, wow, does this mean that maybe the elite of our planet are thinking, oh, maybe we can survive outside this planet, you know, if things get really difficult? Like in the movie Don't Look Up, if any of you have seen it, you know, that sort of perspective.
Exactly what I thought.
Yeah. And of course, there isn't, I mean, this planet is so unique. It is so amazing. It is so unreplicable. It is such like a glorious thing that is difficult to think of how you would think, yeah, let's keep destroying it and we'll find an alternative somewhere, or let's keep, you know. So I think I don't see a way out of the donuts conclusions. I don't see a way to opt out of thinking about this as the primary goal for our species of this time. I mean, yeah, I think it's those technological advances might be helpful on the margins, getting rid of some waste here and getting, you know, mining some extra things because we ran out, but it's going to be marginal. And if we only, and this is actually a problem in sustainability sometimes, is we sometimes celebrate the marginal and give ourselves a comfort like it is fixing the fundamental problem, but it's not. And we wasted a lot of time sometimes celebrating marginal things that we're never going to actually get to the root of the problem that we have. And the donut, I think, forces us to think in that way.
Fantastic. Yeda, please go ahead.
Thanks, Heinrich. Very good food for thought. I just want to call for two things that are in my mind. The first one, when you put all the pressure on companies to do good and be the savior of the planet, that to a certain extent reduce the obligations that the state does, because there is failure of the state to also do the obligation when you put pressure only the companies to be the saviors and do good doers. And the second point is about pick and choose, because you show the hierarchy of do nothing to do the donut, and some companies, they pick and choose where they want to be. It doesn't mean they are on the top doing everything that they need to do the donut. How do you see the evolution of this? Because it's very good, as you mentioned, Unilever, that they distribute things, they buy back shares, increasing the shareholder, but doesn't mean that they do all the things that you consider the donut.
No, I fully agree with you that, yeah, I mean, that framework of just recognizing the inconsistencies within a company, within different product lines, picking and choosing for this one, actually short term, like that brand is well positioned to be our sustainability brand. You know, it's reaching the kinds of consumers that will reward us sufficiently, etc. I know that thinking well from that industry, and I agree with your premise that actually people have you know, use these concepts sometimes in a very pick and choose way that undermines the credibility of those concepts. And in relation to the state and the role of the state, I mean, I think hopefully the way that we are framing our approach is that this isn't saying that any of the state's responsibilities are gone. We're not saying a provision of public services, the need for regulation, the need for all of these things. It doesn't undermine it, but I think what we've seen is that, for instance, if the state were to regulate on human rights, if the state were to regulate more effectively on human rights or on the environment, on deforestation, on, you know, waste in electronics, etc., that would be great. But companies will be pulled in to do more of that. if we design the companies in a way where their interests are aligned with that and their goals are aligned with that, it will mean that the regulation will be more effective, because then the companies are not looking for ways to say, actually, let's outsource this, so it's not our problem, and let's like report this bit but not that bit. And like regulations often are a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a chasing each other game as well. And if we just give up and say, okay, companies are going to be greedy, companies are not going to do the right thing, companies are going to try to avoid, you know, the costs of the regulation, and it's only for the states to regulate and force companies to behave differently, then I think we're missing a trick. We can also like help the state by changing the company, but not necessarily reducing the state's obligation. It just makes, hopefully, aligning a little bit more and making it the consistency a little bit stronger. So that's the goal. And I sometimes get critiqued on this and go, well, what about, like, let's just leave the companies on, let's get the regulations really high, really strong. But I think the regulation needs help as well. And if we know how to help it along, it's going to be more effective.
Yeah, I fully agree, Erinch. And Miguel, please. Miguel is close to you. He is in Portugal, so it's just near there.
Ah, good. Hi, Miguel.
How are you, Erinch? First of all, a personal disclaimer. I'm an admirer and a user of your approach to advocate that we need a new ethics for life on Earth. So I think, and what I really like about your approach is that it's a comprehensive approach rather than a siloed framework like the mantra that we are constantly hearing about, the ESG agenda. And I definitely prefer your approach, much more comprehensive and holistic, a holistic view rather than a segregated and a siloed vision like the ESG. I still feel today that when we hear that ESG mantra, we are much more focused on compliance and on addressing expectations from raters and from indexes, all of that, rather than a deep-rooted willingness to change the world. So, and I think with your approach, that's much more close to that deep-rooted willingness to make a change. I sense that we need scale and speed.
Mm-hmm.
All of us, we are witnessing this exponential degradation of our natural resources, of our planet, and we need scale and speed. What would be your let's say thoughts or insights about that? Because good cases and benchmarks and examples like the one you've mentioned, I think there are good all over the world, good examples all over the world. But I think we need momentum. We need to make this change happen in a faster way and in a deeper way. What would be the recipe for that?
Yeah,
I mean,
Erinch, if I may just complement Miguel's question, because I have a closely related one. And also, if we can take a picture of this gathering here, of this event, just because otherwise some people may have to leave. So just to make a registration again of this moment.
yeah.
Angela, she is our...
Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Let's see if
Is it good?
yeah, it's good. It's good.
Fantastic. So just to complement Miguel's, because I think his point is very, very important, the idea of scale and speed. And a couple of months ago, we had a conversation with Alison Taylor. She is the executive director of ethical systems. And she wrote an article at Harvard Business Review with the title, "We shouldn't always need a business case to do the right thing." And I think this is a very powerful title. And her core idea is important because we live in this era dominated by the ESG acronym, as Miguel mentioned. So do you believe that an approach to sustainability that is dependent on business cases, of course, in particular for large companies, is likely to backfire, because we have to have this kind of broader, holistic view, just to complement Miguel's point?
Yeah, I think you're right, and yeah, I'll start off with Miguel, your question, which I think is the great challenge of our time, is how do we get these examples? And I admitted, I think a few times as well, that these are marginal. You know, Fairphone's doing it, but Samsung isn't doing it. You know, even Apple isn't really doing it. You know what we're talking about. You know, I've got some nightmare stories from some of those companies, of their suppliers, of their, you know, people who've worked with them. So why is it that these things are on the margins? And essentially, it's because this is how we have designed our policy ecosystem. You know, the way financial markets are regulated and created, the way that corporate accountability works, the way corporate legal forms work, the way that, you know, everything that is set up around the company, of what the company is, which is a human design. We designed this, like we said, it doesn't walk around in the jungle. The publicly listed shareholder wealth maximizing company does not walk around in the Amazon. It's something people sat down. We made this to optimize for maximum capital growth. You know, that we optimize for scarcity of financial capital in the 20th century, essentially. And now it's not financial capital that is scarce, it's human and natural capital that is scarce. So what would it look like for us to optimize for those things? Well, we need new structures. And I think the scale issue is going to happen when we get to enough of a tipping point that we cannot just pretend that we can use last century's institutions that were designed to do other things. They're not designed to do what we want them to do. They're designed to make much more limited impact on sustainability. We need to challenge the idea that they are sufficient, that actually we can just change them a little bit, or we can kind of incentivize them a little bit, regulate them a bit better, and they will move us along. I think the faster we can move the conversation to the fact that the design of the enterprise, design of financial systems around it has to change rapidly, the faster we're going to move there. So our theory of change, if I were to write one down, would be that we need those innovative, pioneering business leaders to speak up about the importance of that deep design of the business and how important that is to enabling them to do the things they do. And we need to then move some progressive capital with this, and progressive investors, and beyond the ESG stuff, beyond, you know, the tweakism that's happening, the opportunistic, you know, investment that sometimes happen in ESG that's come today, gone tomorrow, and actually now ESG is struggling, so let's move it into oil and gas, and that's booming, and you know, like that's not going to be the solution either. So I think once we get moved from the business leaders to the investment leaders, then we can really make a case to governments to say, look, you can do this, and you will not be punished by the international financial system. You will not be punished by the international economic and trading system. You can have a direct policy to say, how do we shape the companies of this economy? How do we shape the startups? How do we change tax codes to incentivize a transition into these sorts of alternative models that we are creating now around the world? I see that as the main path, because then we can decentralize those efforts and let the companies and the communities around them be participants in that transition, rather than it being top down on everything. And I think that decentralized approach is going to require much more effort. And Alex, I agree with your question that, you know, it sounds like Alison Taylor's approach is very similar. The bit I think we are adding on top of that is that it's not just about changing the voluntary ethics of the individuals at the top, but how do we support those individuals with the right structures around them so that they are not doing something that they are punished for? That, you know, we've had Paul Polman was punished by financial markets for doing what he did with Unilever. You know, he eventually left, but there was a very aggressive bid to stop Unilever doing what it was doing. There was a takeover bid, and a very hostile one. Same with Emmanuel Faber in Danone. You know, like very much punished by financial markets for showing leadership. So why don't we create those enterprise designs, the financial designs, to support those sorts of individuals?
Fantastic, great point. And so we have Angela's question, and then I'll have a final one, okay? It's just for us because of the time constraints. So Angela, please.
Yes. Well, Andrew, I would like to know if you see some different gender participation in the more cooperative models and the more sustainable models. If you see more of the female participation in these models, because if you see that, if it is just a coincidence, or if you believe that it's because the new business it would be inclusive by this core, or just because the corporate world expelled women? And the second question, I'll be quick, okay? We have a lot of directors here. So what would be questions that they would make, that they could make for their directors, their companies, to start to make them work and think about this different paths that we can build to make the change? That's it. Thank you so much.
Fantastic questions, Angela. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes. Anecdotally, as in there are many more women in leadership positions in the kinds of alternative models that are emerging. And I'm not just saying, like, I'm putting aside some of the older models, but the more emerging steward ownership models, the new social enterprise models, you know, these post-growth entrepreneurship. There's a movement called Zebras Unite that has created something called Exit to Community. Across those, I see many more. I also know very in depth and scientifically that the answer is yes, because when I was leading the World Fair Trade Organization, we had 400 plus social enterprises in 82 countries that were part of my organization. Some of them were, you know, medium-sized businesses, 10 million, or some were 100 million actually turnover a year. Some were much smaller. The majority of them were led by women as CEOs. The majority of senior management was women, and the majority of boards were women. That was not a requirement. That is not a requirement of fair trade, that the majority, or that the CEO has to be a woman, or the majority. There was no actual checking of this. It happens sort of naturally. You start creating a model that is not just about aggressively growing, aggressively increasing profits, aggressively extracting dividends, and you start innovating different ways of having board systems, management systems, profit reinvestment, margins, long-term relationships. It creates also a more inclusive environment as a side product. Not, you know, it was never part of the original design. You'd hope it happened, but the priority was, how do we have supply chain working in a particular way, and how do we create a business that will commit to its supply chain with particular principles? But a side effect, a very positive side effect, was that it was you also had gender equality. In fact, you had majority female, 50% plus in all of those categories are listed. So there's a report actually on the WFTO website that I authored with some researchers on this before I left. You can see it at wfto.com/join the business revolution is the website. But that was over a couple of years ago that I did that research with my team. The last thing in terms of directors is, I think, the big question. And so I don't know which of you are, so I'm looking at a lot of your faces now to see where you are with these ideas, whether they seem, I don't know how they land. But what I would sort of say is that the conversation doesn't have to be about the scariest, biggest, boldest, most ambitious change, but it's about saying, how do you move the organization's deep design along with you in some way? It might be, as I said, just small things like, let's have a rotating observancy for an environmental NGO and a social NGO, or a union group, or a supplier group, or, you know, it could just be an observancy. It might be that, look, a small percentage of profits is automatically put into a fund. That fund is going to fund the kinds of investments that maybe don't meet the capital expenditure requirements, the payback periods that you would normally expect, but the impact is high. So we realize it's important for the long-term resilience of our business. Or we apply some flexible margins for certain things that we know are important, or we start changing, you know, the ownership slightly, where over time we're buying back some shares, and as a part of that we change the structure. I don't want to be propositional, because I think when you let yourself think about these ideas and go, what are some of the things that I didn't even think of, none of us thought of yet, you come up with more interesting and unique ones for your business that enable the right kinds of social and ecological outcomes. But it doesn't have to be the highest bar of, you know, the scariest thing. It could be a slow start, but having the conversation alongside everything you're doing financially, ecologically, socially, as well as, what about design of the enterprise? How is that going to change over time? That the way we are today doesn't have to be the way we are in 10 years. Over time, let's move in that direction. That would be my invitation, and I will hopefully share with you guys in the next few months as well, our guide that we are creating for directors, for leaders in the business world, for financiers and business schools, to have that journey of how you would have that discussion, exploration activities to come up with ideas.
Yeah, I think that the word that you mentioned, invitation, I think everything here is a big invitation for us to come up with the solutions. It's in our hands. It's not in the hands of the state, you know. And so I'm very glad to hear that you're going to elaborate something designed for, you know, business leaders. So how can they go ahead with that? This is actually my last question, is that you know, for those interested in getting involved with the Doughnut Economics movement, you know, including, I know you have a lot of tools, the methodology is very detailed. What are your recommendations? You know, what can we do to help disseminate this beautiful and critically important worldview? And also, if you have any activities or partnerships taking place here in Brazil, because for us it's just this is a kickoff conversation. It's not a finish line, you know. It's a starting point. So please, Erinch, count on us to disseminate this, to support Dio's work, which is beautiful. Your work, it's very important. It's not I really believe it's not a nice to have. It's something that it's essential for all of us. It's just a matter, you know, of time. And I think we have to have this, you know, this moral leadership to go ahead and to put these issues which are essential. So, and not just expect, you know, regulators. Only to conclude my talk here, you mentioned Apple. I was seeing a documentary about, you know, lobbying in the EU. So the EU legal, not department, the whole area, they have about 80 lawyers to craft the regulations. And just Apple, they have more than 200 people in their legal departments, you know, how to deal with that. So it's of course it should come from within and not from an external agent. So Erinch, please feel free to make your conclusions here. And on behalf of this group, I would like to deeply thank you once again for being here with us and taking your time. It was a memorable occasion for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. And so the only thing I would leave you with is, if you work in a company that just wants to have a short 3-hour exploration of these ideas at leadership level or other level, plan something for early next year, because what we're going to launch by the end of this year is quite a detailed methodology on how you would have that journey. So we'll be giving activities, we'll be giving slides, we'll be giving canvases to print or to do on Miro online. We'll be giving guidelines for somebody to sit and quite easily run that workshop within the business of exploring these ideas of Doughnut economics and enterprise design. If you're in a business network, you can do this with multiple businesses. And again, we'll be sharing that. And if you're at a business school or you're a thought leader, you work with clients and you're a consultant, all of this will be in the public for people to use, because we want to help this conversation happen in a way that is accessible, innovative, and ambitious. And that combination, I think there is a demand for it, and we're excited to be creating it. So Alex, I'll also share with you our draft for your input before we finish it, but towards the end of this year, we will be publishing it. So you can start preparing yourselves, I think, for next year, if this is at all convincing for you in some way.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the near future, hopefully. So thank you, all of you, for being us until the very end here. So, and hopefully we'll be in touch to talk more about Doughnut economics and all the issues surrounding it.
And we'll plan a visit to the Action Lab, okay?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we're gonna pay a visit to you there.
We'll look forward to it. I look forward to it.
Thank you so
See you
much.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.